Thank you. That was a lot of me talking with no sound. Let's try this again. So we're doing office hours today instead of a lecture. Stay tuned for a lecture tomorrow. I was just saying that there are several things here in the agenda that are from last week, from the last time we did office hours. And so I think that these first three are left over, and those might have been answered offline or in another context in the meantime. So I added some links to relevant documentation, and I'm going to skip over them for now. If anybody still wants to talk about those, just mention it in the chat or unmute yourself and speak up. And we can talk about them. And I may loop back to them at the end of our office hours if there's extra time, because I think they're interesting topics. But I'm going to prioritize new stuff that I know people are asking about today. So I'm going to jump down to here. I'm noticing sometimes we don't have to pass an argument to a function when we call it, like when we pass console log as a callback. Can you talk about this more? Is this generally for functions that take single arguments? If something takes multiple arguments, do we always have to pass it the arguments? This is a fantastic question. I'm really glad somebody asked this. Is the person who asked this present and willing to identify themselves to talk more about it? If not, that's okay. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. I can jump in. I just don't want to make assumptions about exactly what the question was. So if you were the owner of this question and I start to stray off what you were interested in, just stop me. But let's look at that. So I think what's being asked about here, if I understand it correctly, is the this sort of process where maybe you have some function that's asynchronous. It takes a callback, and that function may do some stuff and then return 42, right? Return some value. And so when you've got a callback function like this, a lot of times, if all you want to do is just log the result, you might call that asynchronous function and then just pass console.log as the callback. So I think this is the type of thing that's being asked about. And if we run this code, we should get 42 printed out, but we don't. Why not? Oh, because I wrote my asynchronous function wrong. That's how that should work. So now if we run it, we see 42 printed out. So we have this kind of awkward thing here where console.log isn't being passed any arguments. It's just being passed into a function. And so what's happening here, so the question said, sometimes we don't have to pass an argument to a function when we call it. And that is actually not correct. You do have to pass arguments to a function when you call it. But the key there is when you call the function. And what's happening here is that console log is not being called on line 5. Console.log is being passed as an argument to async fun, but it's not actually being called here. It's just being passed as an argument. Console.log gets called on line 2. Up in this context, it's called callback, right? It's got a different name up here. But callback is just holding a reference to the console.log function. And that actually gets called on line 2. So it actually doesn't matter how many arguments a function takes. And it turns out that console.log, in fact, takes multiple arguments. Console.log will let you pass it as many things as you want, and it will do its best to print them all out. So we could do that. And all those things get logged out here. So the difference there is that in some contexts you're using a function, but you're not calling it, you're just passing it around. And this is really central to JavaScript and functional programming in general. But one of the things that is distinct, or one of the important attributes of JavaScript, is that functions are what they call first-class citizens, which means a function is just a data type, just like any other data type. So functions are going to be passed around just like numbers or strings, and then called later, or even printed out. So, and actually let's look at that because it's kind of fun. So I'm just opening a node console here. So I'll just create a function, right? Function add, this is my favorite. Take a couple of arguments, add them together. So I've created an add function. And if I look at that add function in the console, so if I just type it in, you know, the console will tell me that, like, this thing you just said, I named this add function is a function. If I type of add, type off add, well, you got to spell things right or it's going to get really mad at you. So type of add is a function. So you see I'm doing type of add just like I could do type of 3 to get number. It's just another value. So here I'm not calling add, I'm passing add to type of and then logging out the result. And functions are actually kind of like objects. In fact, a function is in some contexts, you can almost treat it like a type of object. Functions have a name. So this function's name is add. And functions have a toString method that you can call that will actually give you the text of the function itself. So that's what you're seeing in some cases where you see a function and there's no parentheses, there's not being passed any arguments, is because that function itself isn't being called then, it's just being passed around like any other type of value. And a callback is the classic example of that, where you're passing a function around, you're passing a function as an argument to another function, and leaving it up to that function to maybe call it at some future point. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? It's an important concept. It's a really good question because you'll see that a lot.
Yeah, I think I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
So if you're not writing the function that has the callback, that you're using the existing one, like fs.read file, then my understanding is that you're restricted to the arguments of the call, the arguments that function has decided to pass to the callback, and you don't have a way to add arguments to those. Is that correct?
That's correct. So, I mean, you can imagine a scenario here where this like asynchronous function that we're calling, like maybe we didn't write that. Maybe that's just some built-in function we don't have control over. So it's always going to pass these 4 arguments, say. You don't have control over that. So if we want to pass in a function just like console.log, it's just going to print out those things. If you want to add arguments in, then you're going to have to create your own callback function. The way you'd get around that is create your own callback function that takes in this case, CD, right? So you know the async fun is going to call the callback that you pass it with these 4 things, say. So you can create your own function that accepts exactly what the callback is going to get called with. And then in this, we could say, you know, the arguments are, right? We could pass another argument to console.log before A, B, C, D. And we could pass some after that if we wanted to. So that's how you would get around that. But yeah, if you're using some other function that you're not writing, you don't have any control over, or you can't change, then there's kind of an agreement there that usually in the documentation, that function like set timeout or one of their file system read write, it'll tell you this fs read file accepts a callback function and it's going to get called with these arguments. The callback function will be invoked with these arguments if the write was successful or whatever. And in that case, yeah, you can't just kind of make up your own.
So if you want, let's say you use fs stat, and it doesn't contain the, no, maybe that's not a good example, but you know, I mean, it's an example that doesn't contain, let's say, the path name of the item that it's giving you the facts about. So isn't it the case then that if you have already declared and assigned a value to a variable and your callback is run within the scope in which that variable is accessible, then even though you're not passing that to the callback can still reference it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It'll be in that scope for sure. So yeah, so in your example, you're talking about if you had something out here, that path, right? Then yeah, there's nothing to prevent us from using that inside the callback function. It's still going to be in scope. And that is a good example of a closure, where this function here, this callback function you've declared, kind of closes over this path name variable. So whenever this function gets called, wherever it gets called, it's going to have access to everything that was in scope when it was defined, including this path name variable. It closes over that. Yeah, good question. Any other questions on this? Cool. All right. What's next? What are some good practices for error messages? I've just been throwing error, but should I make my errors nicer? That's another really good question. So, good practices for error messages. Let's think about that. So there are a few different situations in which you're going to be using errors. There are a few different purposes that errors might serve. So some errors, you're going to throw it and you don't intend to catch it necessarily. Like it's a legitimate case that error might bubble up and just end your program or get displayed to a user. And so in error messages that are going to end up propagating out and get seen by end users, you definitely want something that is that's friendly to read, so that's going to make sense to your end user. So sometimes there's a temptation when you're writing error message, you're writing something that makes sense to you when you're looking at the code where the error is thrown. But if that error message is going to get read by one of your end users, it's not going to make any sense to them for you to say, like, this function expected 3 arguments, right? If I'm just clicking on your web page, I don't know what you're talking about, what function, what arguments. And so, for instance, let's think of an example. Well, okay, let's go back to my, so many things that we can do with this silly little add example, right? But say we've got an add function and we're sort of checking the arguments here, right? We're saying if a type of a is not number, new can't type. Yeah, so you could say like must be a number. So this can kind of look like a nice error message to begin with, but you can imagine if this is in the context of some calculator program, right? Some command line calculator program. Hey, let's make one. That'll be easy. We'll just say add process.arg to Okay, so maybe I'm going overboard in this example. Bear with me. Result equals log result. Okay. So we've got like a program here. So this error, if someone doesn't type in a number, it's going to get thrown all the way back out to that user, right? Myself in this case, if I want to add 2 plus 3, I'm going to get a syntax error. Throw new error. What's wrong with that? Must be number, right? So the arguments are coming in as strings, because that's how they come in from the command line, even when you just type numbers. Let's do this check instead. We'll say we'll just make sure it matches a regular expression that matches the number. Test A. If not, unexpected token var, because curly braces go there. Aha. So, okay, sorry, I'm going overboard in the example. Point is, imagine that you had this add method, right? It's in the context of some like command line program, and you're testing for, you know, is a number. Let's just throw some pseudocode in here, right? So if this gets propagated all the way out to your end user, they're going to be wondering like, well, what must be a number and what's the context for that? So if you're writing the kind of errors that are going to be like feedback to your users, you want to be thinking like, put yourself in their shoes, right? What error message is going to make sense to them? And so if it's something that has to do with input, like this add function, right? Then that's a little simpler, right? You can write an error message saying, oh, you know, all of your inputs to this addition program must be numbers, you know, it didn't match what we were expecting. There are other cases where an error is going to indicate that something has gone wrong, that there's a bug in the code. So what's a good example of that? So you may have a function that that reads in some file, right? So you're going to be, the to-do list function is a good example of this, right? If you've done the command line to-do list yet, you're reading a JSON file from the file system to like pull out the saved to-dos to display them. So a user may be doing something like trying to list the set of to-dos, and you might have this fs.read file error result. So you may get in a situation like this where, and in the example code that I've been writing, I think I've just been doing this, like if error, throw error, and then, you know, do something with result down here. So in this case, this is actually not super friendly, right? If for some reason there was an error reading the file, that's not really the user's fault. There's something that's gone terribly wrong with your program. Either the path name that you're using to look for the file is wrong, or the file wasn't initialized when it should have been initialized. And these are all things that sort of indicate a bug in the code. So if at this point, like, you can't read the file for some reason, throwing that error back up to the user is going to be really confusing, right? They're going to get this big stack trace with like lines of code referenced, and it's not a good user experience. So in that case, you probably want to say, you know, create an error message here that's going to be helpful to the user and not confusing. And it's probably just going to be something about like, you know, could not retrieve your to-do list, right? So it's not great. The user's not going to be happy that the program's not working, but at least it has like some kind of nice error. The user's going to at least know that, like, okay, there's a problem retrieving my to-do list. And that's something that they can tell your customer support when they call and say, well, I'm getting this error. It says could not retrieve to-do list. And that leads to the next thing. So this is useful to the user, but as a developer, when you get a call saying, hey, your program's broken and the error we're getting is could not retrieve to-do list, that's not super helpful for you. You probably would like to see what was the error that the file system threw out. Why can't it? Was it permissions error? Was it some other reason the file doesn't exist? The disk is full. And so this error that you're catching here, well, you may like throw up a new error to alert the user that something's gone wrong. You may have like a secondary path for this error to take. And you may want to do something like, if this were a web server, for instance, where this is happening in the concepts of like a web app to-do list, then you might want to log an error. You might want to log the actual error message and say, error encountered, got error retrieving to-do list, and then log out the full context of the error. So all this is sort of getting to, if you're asking about best practices about error messages, keep in mind who the error message is intended for, and like write to that case, write to that user. Make sure that it's going to be useful for them, and think about like who are the different people that are going to care when this error happens, and make sure that you're leaving breadcrumbs for everybody. So a lot of times it is going to be something like displaying one error to your user, but then logging another error for development. Sometimes you'll see like a friendly error message with like something like this at the end. It's like error code page 759. So that, the user sees something they understand. And then when they call your helpline or whatever, they can say, yeah, I got this error. And then the customer service can ask them, oh, well, what error code did you get? And this might link to something specific. This might, the number links to something that a developer would know about. Like, oh, we know that the 8474 error codes are permission errors or whatever. So it might even just be like a random number that you use to, you log that out in the error message that goes to developers. So you can like connect one user's experience to a specific error that gets thrown. That gets logged.
So I have a question about that.
Yeah.
In the context of a command line to-do list application, it would seem like that the user has some control over the file system. And so you might make a decision to make the error displayed to the user include error.message, so that the user can see whether he's perhaps put the file in the wrong place or changed the done CH mode on the file so that the application no longer has permission to read or permission to write, whatever. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah. In that specific case of a command line application, you may be expecting more from your user, and part of the UI of your application might involve the user needing to create files on their own with a certain format and with certain permissions. And if that's really the user experience you want, if you want the user to take care of those things and you don't want your command line application to do it for them, then you'd need to give them more helpful error messages. I would say it's still probably worth it to wrap the kind of messages that you'll get back from Node with something more helpful. So you can still sort of inspect the error and say, oh, this error is like a file not found error. And instead of just printing that out verbatim, you might want to still have a little more friendly message saying that like, you need to create such and such a file with the following permissions, see this section of our manual or whatever. So sometimes it's still worth giving a little bit more like human-friendly, user-oriented messages in those cases. either in addition to the raw message or just instead of it. But yeah, again, it's sort of about like putting yourself in the position of your user and like, what are you assuming your user knows about or is competent to do or should be expected to do? And yeah, if they, if you're writing, if you're writing a script for yourself or like, a dev script or whatever for people that are writing Node and people, if you expect like, yeah, my users are going to be really familiar reading Node stack traces and Node like file system errors, and they'll be able to understand that, then it's probably fine to just like print out what the error was. So it just kind of depends on who your audience is.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So someone was asking how to select and delete in the same SQL query, and then said they figured it out. So I guess we can skip over that. I was going to say, I don't know that you can select and delete in the same SQL query, or there may be some like kind of wonky ways that you can. But in general, I would say if you really need to do those things as like an atomic thing, you might look into transactions. But it sounds like whoever asked that figured it out. So
I think I ended up just deleting the query, but then returning star, and I was able to take the data in the promise and feed it back in. So yeah,
okay,
that worked. Yeah.
All right. Cool. Okay, that's everything that's on the agenda from this week. There's some of the stuff that was left over from last week. I'm happy to talk about use strict and when to use arrow functions if anyone present is interested in that. If that sounds fun to you, just maybe give that a +1 in the chat. Or we can spend some time talking about other things if you all have other questions you want to ask. Anybody have anything?
Can we just talk about, Danielle said the arrow function. I guess the thing I would want to add is like about testing and using sign-on for like spying on a console log statement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. We can do both of those things. Let me do arrow functions first, and then we'll talk about sign-on. So when to use or not to use arrow functions versus regular functions. So the arrow functions, which is just reference, so we all know we're talking about the same thing. So the arrow functions are just an alternative function syntax. So instead of saying function this, you can say, and I'm sure you all know this by now, you can do it this way. So it's two ways to do roughly the same thing in JavaScript. And there's a couple different reasons that the arrow functions exist. One thing I should say is they're newer. JavaScript didn't used to have these arrow functions. It used to just be, if you want to write a function, it always looks like this first example. One of the reasons for introducing the arrow function is just that it's shorter to type, especially in a language where you're passing anonymous functions around as an argument a lot. So when you're doing something like set timeout function, you have a lot of these callbacks where you're just going to log like time's up. It's kind of annoying to have to type function every time. So the arrow functions just give you a little bit better, less noisy syntax for doing this. Where you can kind of get that down to that, and it just sort of removes this awkward function thing. And it turns out that the curly braces are optional if you just have one statement in your function, so you can even get rid of those. And then you can start to get to something that looks kind of like this. Guess we would need like a duration in our timeout. But, so that's one reason for the arrow functions is just it's cleaner to type in some situations. And so that would be one thing to consider when you're deciding like, do I want to use arrow functions or not? Sometimes it's just a matter of like what looks cleaner in the context that you're writing them in. And I would say a lot of times if you're passing a function as an argument anonymously like this, where you're not like naming it somewhere else and passing it in, but you're just like defining the function in line, the arrow functions are often a lot simpler. The other reason, the other difference between arrow functions beyond they just look cleaner in some contexts is they have different semantics around scoping. And let's look at that. Oh, I can't leave this here. I'm always deleting code. And what's this? Is it in here? Okay. I was playing with this a little bit in preparation. So this is an example of using just the normal functions. And we're going to talk a little bit about like how the normal syntax of functions handles things like scope. So we've got we're creating a class here, right? Or a constructor, I think is probably the better term to use in JavaScript, right? So we're creating a constructor that's going to help us like build new objects, and they're people objects, and they have an age, and when they get created, this set interval thing happens where they're going to grow up every 100 milliseconds. Their age is going to go up by 1. These people grow up really, really, really fast. So if we create a new person and log their age right away, it should be 0, right? And then if we log their age again in like 500 milliseconds and then exit the process, they should be like 5 years old, right? So that's what you would expect, but it turns out that if we actually run this code, what we're going to see is there's 0 at the beginning, and then there's still 0 when we go to check their age 500 milliseconds later, right? They should be at least 4 or 5 at this point, but we're still getting 0. And what happens is this variable. So when you declare a function like this, when you declare a function using this syntax, inside that function, this, by default, the keyword this, is going to refer to the global object, right? It's not going to be the context. It's not going to be the this context that the function was defined in. So we sort of have this constructor, and inside the constructor, this, the keyword this, refers to the instance of the object that's being created. But when you define a new function, it comes with its own concept of what this is. And so what you see a lot in JavaScript code that predates the arrow function is things like this, where we're going to create a new variable, that, and we're going to assign this to it. Or sometimes you'll see this self. And then down here, we can say self.age. And we sort of have to do this awkward thing of like rename this to self, or like copy it into a variable called self, because that variable will get closed over. Like this function, like we saw earlier today, functions will still have access to things that were defined in their scope, right? So it'll have access to the self variable, and we can use that. And if we do this, that should fix our code, right? So we get 0 and 4, like we expected. And this,
okay.
Yeah,
So I definitely understand why set interval would create a new scope for this, but I don't understand why this would be in the global scope instead of like set interval having a this.
Can you say that again?
You said that, yes, actually it's the grow up function that defines this as the global object. Why would it not be grow up.this? Like the way that with person, that this is for the person function.
Gotcha. So it's the nature of just how JavaScript works. Like function, when you're declaring a function by default, this inside a function will refer to the global object. But the reason that's not happening in this person function is because person is a constructor, and we're invoking it this way. We're saying new person. And in that case, when person is being used as a constructor, this has slightly different meaning. And instead of just being a reference to the global object, it's a reference to the object that's being created by the constructor.
That makes
so
sense.
That's just because of how we called person here, because we said new person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, great. So this is how you get around that, like a sort of an old school JavaScript pre-arrow function. So one of the things they did when they introduced the arrow function is they gave the arrow function slightly different semantics. So the arrow function retains the same this as the code where it's defined. So if I set my set interval to be an arrow function, I can go back to referencing just this. And JavaScript, when it creates this arrow function, won't give it sort of the default of this, the global object to this semantics. It'll allow us, it'll basically treat this the same way it treats any other variables that are defined in the scope where the function is defined. So it'll treat it just like self. It'll just close over the this from the outer context. And so we should still get correct behavior here. And I would imagine that's yeah. We'll get 5 or 4 just depending on the erase condition, right? It just depends on how fast the code runs, since we've got these set timeout intervals. But so that's another reason why you might want to use an arrow function, or might not want to use an arrow function, because it sort of turns on this behavior of this getting overwritten or not. And one of the places that you'll probably see this come into play is if you're using Mocha. Mocha does this thing where, you know, its whole interface is based on these callback functions, right? And while you will normally see me use the arrow syntax if I'm, you know, like with set interval, like I would usually use the arrow syntax here just for the way the code looks. But in Mocha, you always want to use function, because it turns out that Mocha is relying on this behavior that this function is not going to be like inheriting some this from the surrounding context. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail about like why that is. But just beware that with Mocha does stuff with this, so you can I guess I am going to go into a little bit more detail. That's not what I want. Before each, no, I did set that up. So Mocha has a concept of this, which gives you like state for each individual test. So you can set things on this that you want to have be like state for your test, and then in your test, if we log out this dot count down here, we're going to get 1. Anyway, so Mocha has this concept of a this, which sort of refers to the current test that's being run. So one way you could use this is you could have 2 tests named green and blue. And I believe that like there's a name attribute or something like that, where in your before block, I could say if name equals green. And then I could have some like special logic here that only runs like this before each block is going to get run before each of my tests. But I could do something special if the test that I'm currently running happens to be the green test. I'm not saying that's a smart way to set things up, but it's one of the things you can do with the this keyword in Mocha. This always sort of refers to the state of your current running test. And it turns out that this behavior just breaks all kinds of ways if you use arrow functions for these describe and before each and it callbacks instead of the like this other traditional function syntax. So anyway, that's a little bit of an aside about Mocha, but you don't necessarily have to know all the details about it. Just know, like, always use this syntax in Mocha and you'll be fine. You won't run into any weird behavior.
Are there any other strange things that happen because of the strange scoping with arrow functions, or is it just with this?
As far as I know, it's just with this. That's my understanding. And I was sort of scanning through the documentation right before this to make sure that I wasn't forgetting anything. But I think that's the primary thing.
The arguments variable is also affected.
The arguments variable?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Like you can usually use arguments just to give you the list of arguments passed to the function, but you can't do that with arrow functions.
Oh, okay. So does it inherit that from the surrounding context the same way that
so
it inherits
it recommends
this?
if you want to do that to use a rest parameter.
Gotcha.
So that is to capture all the arguments and then spec that.
That makes sense. Okay, so this and arguments. Where's that? Oh, it's here. I linked to it.
I added a question in the chat too.
Oh, right, yeah. No binding of this. No binding of arguments. There it is, yeah. Methods. Yeah, so this MDN page is a good resource for that. We'll go into a lot more detail. Jonathan, so your question, MDN says you can omit the braces if the body contains a single expression, but not if it contains a single statement. Can you clarify the distinction? Does it say not if it contains a single expression?
Well, on that page in the syntax right there that you're looking at, it shows the braces omitted in the case where there's an expression, but not in the case, it doesn't show a similar case of statement substituted for expression, and where it has statements in the plural, the braces are there.
Right, yeah. So if you have, so if you have multiple statements, you need the braces. I think it's a terminology thing. I'm probably using statements and expressions, like a statement and an expression, a little interchangeably. But yeah, okay, so I get this a little different. So the wrinkle there is that I can use the arrow function. So I can do things like this. If I wanted to add a b, right? My favorite add function. I can do a plus b. I can do that, which you could think of a plus b as a statement or an expression. Probably the reason that they're using different words there is that if I was going to change this to a statement, it would be a return statement. Return, right? That's the equivalent thing. Put these right next to each other. So in this case, it's not like a full statement. It's sort of the expression piece of a return statement. And the other thing you can't do in this context is if I had some other variable out here, I had some like let x equals 0. And if in here I wanted to say something like x equals 5, I believe I need to put braces around that. So there may be some nuance in the way they're using the term expression versus statement that I'm not picking up on. But in general, it's the same thing. It's you can think of it either way, but I guess technically it's an expression that is acceptable here. But most of the things you would do in a statement would work in an expression. But I guess other things that probably wouldn't work as like an if block. You can't just start putting an if block in here. So it is a little bit different. An expression is sort of like a chunk of code that's going to like resolve to something. So it's like a function call or an addition or sort of anything inside parentheses. Does that make sense? Or does that just make it more confusing?
Yeah, I think I have an intuitive sense of the distinction, but it does make sense. And
Yeah.
especially if an expression is interpreted in that context as a return of the expression.
Yeah.
Then it's basically saying, okay, like you must give me an expression and then we will return it. So it would be, you couldn't return a statement like an assignment, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So yeah, one thing one way to think about it is probably like it's anything that you could type return before would be an expression. So yeah, it's going to rule out things like in JavaScript anyway, like if blocks and loops and for loops, and it needs to be something that like evaluates to some value that could be returned.
Yeah, so you used console.log as an example, and I was asking myself, would that require braces or not?
Console.log. Oh yeah, no. This is so yeah. Just calling a function is an expression. Console.log just returns undefined. Pretty sure. But it is an expression. It's a function, and you're calling the function, and the function returns undefined. And it's not a pure function. It has like side effects, but it's still an expression because it's
Got it.
you can you could return console.log, return the result of that. Just be undefined.
Yeah, so it's sort of like A plus B. It's just which is operator rather than a function.
Yeah.
It's still something that results in an expression.
Yeah. And someone was asking about sign-on and console.log, right? I want to make sure we get to that. So let's take a look at that. What is it just like generally like how do you do that with sign-on? How would you stub out console.log? Or was there something more specific? Who was asking about that earlier? Are they still here? All right, we'll just take a look at it then. So, and I think that there's Patrick. Did Patrick bail on us? All right. Is that something that y'all are interested, those who remain? Would that be useful for us to look at sign-on and mocking out console.log? Give me like a +1 and pass on it. Okay. All right, cool. Anything else you want to talk about?
Trevor, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I really like writing shorter functions with arrow functions and stuff. What is your rule of thumb for breaking down a function into multiple lines instead of like a single line?
What's for breaking it into multiple lines?
Yeah, sure. How do you decide like if you're gonna write like a single line function, or you're breaking it down into multiple lines, I guess. Yeah.
That's a good question. Let's see. So, I mean, the thing you're going for there is you want the code to be readable. So sometimes putting something on one line makes the code readable, but you want each line of your code to read like sort of a single thought, like a single sentence, just like prose. And so if you've got something, let's think about it this way. So in a normal function, you've got like the function and it's got some name and some arguments, and then you got like something happening inside it, right? Like work happens here. And if the work you're doing is so simple, so that console.log is a good example, right? Where you just have some like set timeout, and you're doing something like really simple, and you're not even passing arguments. So this is a good example here. You're doing something really simple like a console.log. So you're not even passing arguments to the function, right? You're just ignoring those. So in that case, all of this boilerplate about the name and the arguments and taking up a whole line for that doesn't really seem to make any sense, because it's meaningless, right? It's not telling us anything, because it would just be like nothing happening, and it would be a name that never gets used anywhere else. So in that case, one line kind of makes sense to me. What you want to avoid is, so I would say, as much as I hate to talk in absolutes, I would never do something like this, where say you've got a function that has multiple statements, right? So you get the braces, and if there's going to be multiple statements, I would never just keep them all on one line to do commas, right? So if you had like, maybe you're going to say, let A equals the result of this, and then you're going to say A plus B equals, let C equals. So at this point where you're sort of doing multiple things, and then you're saying return C plus 2. So you can get that all on one line, right? And it's not running off the end of the page. But there are, in addition to declaring a function, there's 3 distinct things happening in the function. I'm calling foo, and then I'm doing some addition, assigning that to C, and then I'm like returning these 2 things. So even though this code is terse, it's really dense. There's a lot of different distinct things happening there. And in general, you probably want each of those distinct things to be on their own line, so that when someone comes in to read it, they can look at a line of code and only have to be sort of digesting kind of one thing at a time. So definitely you want multiple lines in your function if you have multiple statements. If you're having to use like semicolons to separate statements on a single line, then you want to start to break that up.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I would say I would use the same thing in like if statements while we're here, because this comes up a lot. You can end up with if statements that start to span a lot, like the condition. So a lot of times you'll end up with like, well, okay, if A is greater than or is less than B, and power is on, or date is Friday. When you start to get if statements like this, it's sort of a same rule where like, okay, there's 3 different things going on here, and parsing through these things with the ands and the or is really difficult. And at that point, I'd say it's acceptable to even put multiple lines in your if condition, so people can kind of come through and see this one by one, and where you put the closing parenthesis is sort of a matter of preference, right? But even this stuff you might want to start breaking up into multiple pieces. And if that gets too confusing and too many lines, then you may want to start renaming some of these expressions to make them a little bit more readable, right? You come down here and say, is Friday. Anyway. So it's a little bit about multi-lining. Anything else? We got a few minutes left before I got to wrap up. If not, y'all enjoy the rest of your Monday and just reach out to me in Slack or your other SCPs and coaches. Have a good week. Bye, everybody.